In this video, I'm gonna show you how to create this cute little coin purse. This coin purse pattern is from my Aster series. If you are familiar with my channel and my patterns, you'll know that there is a series of patterns called Aster that includes a crossbody purse, this organizer for that purse, which is a cute zipper pouch with multiple pockets, so you can slip it in your crossbody purse and have all your items organized. And now I wanted to add another small pattern, so we can use up any scrap of vinyl that we have left from those projects and just create additional small little item. This pattern, it's a free pattern and it's available for download. The link to the pattern is in the description box below, so you're just gonna follow the link and you're gonna have access to download this pattern. If you are interested in viewing the rest of the series patterns, the pouch and the crossbody bag, the links for those patterns are in the description box below as well. Also, if you would like to join my sewing community, you can join my Facebook group. The link to the Facebook group is in the description box below as well. Also, if you like my sewing tutorials and my patterns, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and to give the video a like. Now, let's get started. When you download the pattern, it will come with some intro notes along with those printable pattern templates. You can use either of them as the template for the accent vinyl. My little scrap of vinyl was in a size that I could only use it on the left side, so that's what I did, but it's totally depends on you. I just wanted to create a set for this pouch, so I just had a vinyl that will allow me to use the accent fabric on that side, but you can use either way. So then I cut my second front panel from the plain vinyl and the back also from the plain vinyl. You will also use the template number 3 for your lining, and that's all the pieces you need to cut out. You would also need coordinated thread. You would also need this metal purse frame. It's also sometimes called a kissing clasp because those two closing elements kind of kiss. So this size of a clasp for this pattern, it's a 3.5 inches in width, so that's something to keep in mind. So that's basically all the supplies that we need to create the project. So first step, we're gonna connect our front panels. So we put everything else to the side and we're just gonna place both front panels right sides together and clip along the center edge. When you have that done, you're gonna take it to the machine and you're gonna sew along this edge with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you can use 2.5 stitch length. After that's done, we're gonna top stitch our seam so the seam allowances are lying nice and flat. Now that our front panels are connected, we're gonna butterfly the seam allowances on the back of our project. So you just want to make sure it's nicely open and the seam allowances are behind corresponding panels. When you have that kind of finger pressed, you're gonna take it to the machine and you're gonna top stitch along the seam on both sides with the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and 4mm stitch length. Now that you have the seam top stitch and the seam allowances are nice and flat on the back, we're gonna take our panel 3 and we're gonna transfer those little marks on the panel. And we're gonna repeat the same thing on our back panel. All right, so we have that marked. Now we're gonna take our two outside panels. We're gonna place them right sides together and clip them along the bottom edge. And we're gonna take it to the machine, and using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, we're gonna sew only along the bottom edge. And then we wanna repeat what we did with the central seam. So after you have your two panels connected, you're gonna open the seam allowances and top stitch along each side of the seam, making sure that the seam allowance lies nice and flat behind the corresponding panel. Now that you have the bottom seam completed, you connected the panels and then top stitch the seam allowances so they lay flat behind the corresponding panels. We're gonna move on to connecting our sides. So you're gonna place both outer panels right sides together and clip along the side edges. And at this point, this is where we're gonna be using our little marks, because you wanna make sure that you're gonna be sewing the sides of your project only from the mark down. So you're gonna start your seam on the mark and bring it down, and the same on the other side. Make sure you are back stitching well on the beginning and on the end of the seam. You're gonna be sewing with the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length. Now that our sides are sewn, we're gonna box our corners. So you want to align the bottom and the side seam, clip it together. Do the same thing on the other side. And when you have that prepped, you're gonna take it to the machine and you're gonna sew along those two edges with the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length, and make sure to back stitch well on the beginning and on the end of each seam. Now that our corners are boxed, we can trim the seam allowances so they are smaller. I'm just trimming them a little bit, making sure that all my edges are nice and flat. Now I'm gonna turn the outer right side out. And put that aside. And now I'm gonna work on my lining. So what we wanna do, we wanna align our linings right sides together. Take our template and transfer the little marks. Now that you have the marks transferred, you're gonna clip the panels to secure them. Since we're gonna be using our lining to turn our project right side out, we're gonna mark an opening in the bottom. So make sure it's about 2 inches so you can turn your project easily. When you have your project prepped like this, you're gonna take it to the machine and you're gonna sew from the marks down with the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length. And you're gonna repeat the seam allowance on the bottom, but you're gonna sew only from the outside edges to the opening edges. So you want to make sure that this stays unsewn and that you backstitch well where the opening is, so when we turn our project right side out, it's not gonna unravel. Now that our lining panels are connected on the side and on the bottom, and I left this little opening unsewn, I'm gonna box my corners. And you're gonna now take it to the machine and you're gonna sew each of those openings with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We want to increase the seam allowances on those corners a little bit so the lining fits better inside our pouch. So take it to the machine and sew along those two open spaces with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length. Now that I boxed the corners of my lining, I'm gonna trim the seam allowances a little bit. Now we're gonna work on connecting our outer with the lining. So you wanna take your outer that is right side out and place it inside of your lining, so both units are right sides together. To do that, I like to fold my bottom of my outer up a little bit. That makes it easier for it to fit better in the lining. Now that I have the unit inside, I'm gonna now stretch it and make sure that my top edges align nicely and clip them all around. Start with the middle of the front and then move to the middle of the back. And continue clipping all around. When you have the lining and outer panel clipped together, you're gonna take it to the machine and you're gonna sew with the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length. And you wanna sew only from the point where your stitch ends on the lining and on the outer panel. To make it easier, because it might be a little tricky, you're gonna sew from the middle going towards the side seam and making sure you are opening your fabrics as you sew. So you're gonna place it this way on your machine and start the seam from the midpoint going down and just flattening the panel as you go, making sure the lining stays nice and attached to the back, and finishing your seam where your side seam began. And make sure you're gonna backstitch nicely so they won't unravel. And then you're gonna repeat this, sewing from this side, so starting where your seam ended in the midpoint and going down, making sure you're flattening your panels and finishing your seam at the beginning of your side seam. Repeat that on the back and on the front, and this way you're gonna have your top seam completed. Now that the top seam is completed, we're gonna snip it all around the seam, so when we turn the project right side out, it's gonna lie nicely inside. So you just want to snip the seam allowances, but don't snip the stitching. Now that the seam allowances is prepped, we're gonna turn the project right side out. You're gonna push the seam out so it's nice and curvy. Roll the seam with your fingers. If it's not perfect, don't worry, because that's gonna be covered by our frame, so don't stress yourself out about this seam. When you have that seam nicely pulled out and rolled, just secure that with clips. When you have that clipped, take your project to the machine and top stitch starting 1/2 inch from the side seam. So you wanna top stitch it, but only 1/2 inch above our side seams. This is only a seam that will serve us to hold the panels together. So if your top stitching is not perfect around the curve, don't worry about it. Just make sure the seam allowance it's not any more than 1/8 of an inch, because you want to make sure that this top stitching will be covered by your frame, and it's not gonna go all the way down, because this part may show. So you want to start about 1/2 inch up from the side seam, top stitch with the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you can use 4mm stitch length and just end it 1/2 inch up from your side seam. Now that the top stitching is done, and like I said, I don't even worry that it's not perfect, but all I wanted is to just make sure that the lining and the seam allowance will be held down while I'm attaching my frame. So this is perfect. Now the last thing to do to finish our machine sewing is to close our lining. So you're just gonna pull the lining out of your bag, tack on those open edges that will make them fold inside. Just finger press it. Secure that with clips and take it to the machine and top stitch along the opening with the 1/16 of an inch seam allowance and 2.5 stitch length. Now that my lining is completed and I place it inside of my pouch, I'm gonna move on to attaching my frame to my project. To do that, you wanna take your frame, keep it in a close position so you can find which part is the midpoint of your frame. So it looks like my midpoint will be this hole, so it's the second hole from this little post. Now I can open my frame, place it over my top edge of my front panel. I'm gonna slide it inside and make sure that the second hole from this post is in the middle of my project. I'm gonna attach it with a thread. So first I'm gonna base stitch it onto my purse. This will help me while I'm creating this nice stitch, but to do that I would recommend using a contrasting thread color, so when you're removing the basing stitch you can see it well. So I'm gonna use this dark brown thread, and I'm gonna push the needle through the middle hole. So I'm not worried right now how it looks like. I just want to make sure that I'm pushing my back so the top edge is inside the frame, and I'm just gonna base stitch the frame onto the panel. So just going every second hole, making sure my panel is inside the frame, and just loosely base stitching the frame onto my back. You just want to secure the end of the thread so it doesn't unravel while we are creating the actual stitch. So now that I have this side of my frame base stitch to the panel, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna create this decorative stitch to attach my frame. So I thread my needle now with the same thread that I used to sew my project, and I'm gonna try to hide the knot underneath the frame. And then start sewing the frame on my project. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna go into every second one, and then we're gonna come back to fill in the gaps in between. And my tip for sewing it on is to guide your needle where the back of the frame is. This usually is the point where your hole on the other side is. So just continue sewing on your frame. Now that you got to the other side, you're gonna repeat that, connecting those stitches. And now that you have the one side of the frame attached, you're gonna knot off your thread. You can now remove the base stitching. And now that one side of your purse frame is attached, you're gonna repeat the same method on the back side of your pouch. So you're gonna first base stitch the frame onto the back, and then you're gonna sew it on as you did on the front panel. Now my little project is completed. I finished attaching the back side of the purse frame to my pouch. And now it's ready to use. If you would like to create your own Aster coin purse, please make sure to grab the copy of this free pattern from the description box below. And if you enjoyed this video and would like me to create more, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and to give the video a like. Till the next time.